Welcome to this month's Greg Griffith Leadership Podcast. Join Greg Griffith as we together learn what it means to be leaders of our world as we faithfully love and faithfully lead. Like, share, rate, and review this podcast with your friends and others of influence, for they too are looking for people like you to help them lead and love day to day. Without further ado, here is your host, Greg Griffith.
Hey, thanks so much for joining my podcast, Greg Griffith Leads, where leaders are faithfully living and faithfully leading, faithfully loving. It is such a great time to be with you. I'm so excited and honored that you would take a moment to just listen to this. Please take a moment today, rate, like, review, and share this podcast with someone who will be impacted by it, just like you are. Hey, today I really want to take a moment and I want to talk about something called whiplash. I think we've all heard of this. This is that thing where you are whiplashed forward and then backward. I think this happens to us all the time. Specifically, I think this happens in ministry. I also think this happens organizationally. What is whiplash? Well, we have a system now where we have what we call a feedback whiplash system. And this is where people are continually giving us feedback in anything and everything that we do. This can happen from our home. This can happen to our jobs, and this can happen in our ministries. And so let's talk about how we deal with this. And also, let's talk about how we don't contribute to this, because I think it can be so easy for us to contribute to a whiplash system due to feedback. You and I have feedback happening all the time. Matter of fact, everything that we do, there is feedback. We have more access to feedback today than ever before. 20, 30, 40 years ago, feedback had to happen through a phone call. Then it happened a little bit through email. Today, feedback can happen through texting, through social media, through phone, through personal conversation. It happens everywhere. As human beings, we are more accessible to avenues of communication than we ever have been before, especially through message systems and through social media. And this happens. So what do we talk about when we talk about whiplash feedback? This is where we hear things so good and so well. We see things happening all the time that are great. And so for me as a pastor, this would be when I have a church service and give a message. And then I'm at the end of the day or the end of the services, and I'm in the corridor and I'm having people come up to me and they're saying, "Oh, I loved your message. This part spoke to me. This was great. I love this. This was awesome." And right as I'm finishing up the day, a person would walk up to me and they would say, "You know what? That was a great message, but if you had done it this way, this would have been better." Or, "You know what? That was a great message, but here's what I didn't love. I felt like today all the songs didn't jive with what you were speaking." It's that whiplash that takes us from a good thing and then has the pendulum swing to the bad thing. Now, here's humanity. This happens to us all the time. Humanity is, we remember the bad comments, and they take us into the pit of despair. And when I use that word despair, what do I mean? I don't mean that it's like forever, but man, it definitely dampens the day. This is feedback whiplash. This happens over and over and over again. So two things that I think are very important as we think about feedback. First, when we're the people who give feedback, ask yourself the question, is it critical for me to give this feedback now? Generally, it's not. I think when we give feedback, what usually goes into our head is this convenient? Meaning, I'm here, you're here, let me just tell you because we're here together. But is that feedback helpful? I'm not asking if it's true. It might be very true. Is it helpful in that moment and in that space? Second, when we're giving feedback, we have to evaluate the question of, does this feedback need to be said, and when can it be said? Not all feedback does need to be said, right? I like the saying that says, as Christians, we always tell the truth. As Christians, we don't always have to say the truth. What does that mean? Even if it's true, it may not be necessary to be said, right? If I'm talking to a pastor, or I'm talking to my pastor, or I'm sharing something about a message, and they say something in the final message of the day that I just didn't think mattered or agreed, right? Or they got a story wrong, do I have to share that right then? Will it make a difference? Are they going to share that message again in that day? Probably not. So what's the purpose of it? Well, it's really then about me, right? So I think, too, this can happen in your organization when you complete a project. Great job. Good job, Billy. This is wonderful. Yeah, this was great. Hey, Billy, next time for this project, you should have done this, this, and this. Are you going to do that project again? I don't know. Does that need to be said? Maybe. Does it need to be said then? Probably not. So when do we give feedback? How are we giving the feedback? And when do we have it? Now, those who are receiving feedback, here's the other thing. Find a way. I think it's so important, especially with feedback whiplash. It's really important for us to find a way to say, I need to be open for feedback. So listen to the feedback and say, I know that they're giving feedback because they actually care about this. I will tell you, anyone who's sharing with you feedback actually does care for you. If they didn't care about you, they wouldn't tell you the feedback. Second, though, then as you're hearing that feedback, hear that and say, when you feel something or it's like there and you're just kind of upset, say, you know what, this is so great. I'm so thankful. I'd appreciate it if you could actually send me this feedback later this week. Can I follow up with you later when I'm ready to receive all of this? There's nothing wrong with doing that. You are welcome and able to say to someone, I want this feedback, but right now I'm not ready for it. And that's okay. That's your honest feelings and the way for them to get their feedback to be heard in the best light and heard for what it is. The other thing to receive feedback is if you have systems where feedback comes to you through texting or social media or email, here's what I would invite you to do. After you complete something, and if you're a pastor, I'm speaking a lot to pastors right now. If you're a pastor and you've done Sunday morning, don't check your email Sunday afternoon. Don't go on social media Sunday afternoon. Don't look to see what the comments are and where they are. Sunday afternoon is a totally emotionally draining day for you. You are at a roller coaster of events, of seeing people, being at your best, sharing, and if you're preaching, it means you're publicly speaking. You're on a mountaintop. And you also are coming down off that mountaintop. And so take Sunday afternoon to just regroup, recenter, and reorient. Now, organizationally, if you're a non-faith-based leader and you're out there, this is the same thing for whatever days you're at. Right? So this would be when you complete a project, this would be maybe towards the end of the week, this would be that. Find a time where you say, this isn't the best time for me, right? And know when your good communication times are. Next thing with feedback whiplash is set a rhythm and routine to where you're getting the feedback when you are ready to receive the feedback. There is truth to every feedback you receive. There is truth. Everyone's got good truth in there. There are valid points in all feedback, positive feedback and critical feedback. So Be ready to receive it and then receive that feedback non-personally. Now, that's easy to be said and hard to do. How do you do that? First, know this, it's not about you. So when we think feedback is about us, that is an egotistical, narcissistic response. You're not the center of the world. I'm not either. So that feedback is not about you. It's about a system. It's about something. It's about a person's passion. Second, know that it's not permanent. It's not forever. And third, know that it's not pervasive. Not everyone thinks this, right? So you can hear hard feedback and you can actually digest it well when we don't take it personal, when we realize it's not permanent, and when we know it's not pervasive. And lastly, I think what's really important for us when we take feedback is, and we work on not having the whiplash, is simply to look at it and say, what can I do about this? Now, here's the other thing. Sometimes you have to be okay with people's frustration. If you're a leader, people will be frustrated with you. Now, if it's a frustration that leads them to leave or abandon you, you've got to really honestly look at that. If it's a frustration that they just have, that's all of us. We all have frustrations. I get frustrated when I go to my local grocery store and I see that there's not all the aisles are open or self-checkout has a super long line. That's a frustration I have. Doesn't mean I'm abandoning my grocery store. It just means I'm frustrated a little bit by their system. I don't know everything about it. That's okay. They're okay with some of my frustration, right? So those are the pieces that we want to look at when we have feedback whiplash. Lastly, I would say this for feedback and for any leader or any person that's receiving feedback, savor the feedback that does fill your bucket. And some days your bucket is going to be totally drained. Someone's going to take it and it's just going to have a vacuum and all the water is going to go out. That's when you pull out those cards of encouragement, those notes of joy, and those thanksgiving, and you just look at them and you're reminded it's not pervasive, it's not permanent, and it's not personal. So, in this day and age where communication and feedback is more prevalent than ever before, you're going to have whiplash. Set up your boundaries and your guidelines for how you give feedback and how you receive feedback so that the whiplash is minimized. And that's what is important, to minimize the whiplash today. Hey leaders, it is so good to be with you. I hope that you're seeing that by leading and growing in your leadership, that you are faithfully leading, faithfully living, and faithfully loving. Like, share, rate, review this podcast with someone. And once again, thanks so much for leading together, because as we're leading together, we're leading stronger. Have a great day.
Thank you for being a part of this month's Greg Griffith Leadership Podcast. Join Greg next month for leadership insights to faithfully love and faithfully lead. Now go be terrific today.